Thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to everybody all the groups and organizations that helped make this night possible. It's truly an honor to be giving Bemis Lecture in this storied hall in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and it's an honor to be able to tell you about my book, This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. I gave this talk a few previous times, and I would start it with a pronunciation note saying that the main male character's name is not pronounced Bernard DeVoto, but Bernard DeVoto. I learned that from Avis and Bernard's son, Mark, who is really, truly honored us by being here tonight, his partner, Lois. So thank you again, Mark. Thank you again, Lois. Thank you for the interviews that helped to make this podcast possible. Out of curiosity, how many of you had ever heard of Bernard DeVoto? A few hands. Excellent. I'd like to see it. What about his wife, Avis, who was a little bit more... Okay, some more hands. She's a little bit more prominent in pop culture these days, for reasons I will touch on. I'm not proud to admit this, but despite having been born and raised in Missoula, Montana, which is about 90 minutes from this, I had no idea who the DeVotos were until I found a Bernard DeVoto book in the Strand bookstore in New York City, where I now live and work as a freelance journalist. This is the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. It is on top of the Bitterroot Mountains. It's near the border of Idaho and Montana. It's inside the Clearwater National Forest, which is part of America's incredible suite of hundreds of millions of acres of public lands. This story I'm going to tell you over the next hour or so with minimal spoilers. It's a love story. It's a story about the McCarthy era. But overall, it's a story about public lands conservation. And I'm going to tell you why the DeVotos are so honored on our public lands for the role that they played in the McCarthy era to help protect and defend our public lands. This grainy video is Bernard DeVoto, 1954, pointing at what started his interest in conservation. That is his maternal grandpa's farm at the base of the Wasatch Mountains near Ogden, Utah. That's where Bernard was born in 1897. Such an adorable kid that family lore has it that he won a beauty contest. Those days are numbered. This is his mother, Rhoda. She is born into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She falls away from it, becoming what I heard growing up colloquially referred to as a Jack Mormon. But it is her father, Samuel, who brings that part of the DeVoto family to North America. Samuel immigrates from rainy England to desert Utah in the 1850s after he converts to Mormonism, and he becomes a farmer, which was incredibly difficult. Sometimes in New York, people who know that I'm from the West will ask me, what is the story with public lands? Why are there so many? Why are there different designations? Are they just scenery? Are they just federal tyranny? And the simplest answer that I can give to such a complex question is the same answer that Bernard DeVoto's grandpa figured out, which was the same answer that the ancestral Puebloans who lived and farmed in the American Southwest 1,000 years ago figured out. And the answer is water. Because unlike drizzly England, unlike the humid Northeast, where enough precipitation to support a family farm falls from the sky in the form of rain across vast expanses of the U.S. West, most of the precipitation catches as wintertime snow on the tops of high mountains, and the key to survival in the West is getting that snow melt, that water, down from the tops of those mountains into the valleys below, sometimes multiple states away, because that's where the towns and farms and ranches and cities are. And in order for that process to happen, you have to have healthy forests and healthy grasslands. And so at the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, our first great conservation president, he created more than 150 national forests in the West to protect that water supply, including the Wasatch National Forest above Ogden. And that made a profound impact on young Bernard DeVoto because one of his chores was helping to irrigate his grandpa's farm. Though Bernard DeVoto loved the West, loved its people, loved its scenery, loved its history, in 1950, he relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts. He enrolled at Harvard University. When World War I came, he enlisted in the Army. You can see in this photo of him in uniform here that his nose has been flattened. He tried playing baseball as a boy, and he got his nose shattered by a bat. His days of winning beauty contests were done. But while he was not aesthetically blessed, while he was not athletically gifted, he was incredibly smart. And he really thrived at Harvard. And he understood how smart he was. By the time he was in his early 20s, he wrote, quote, "My mind is as good as there is." So you can see it in tumults. Well, while his mind was as good as could be, his heart wasn't. Not until in 1922 he met the love of his life, Helen Avis McVicker. Avis DeVoto was born on the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She was surrounded on all sides by Lake Superior. Avis was also fearsomely smart. Like Bernard DeVoto, she also loved to read. She was also very stylish, very fashionable. And one thing to know about Avis DeVoto was that she was fearless. She was absolutely daring. And she and Bernard were attracted to each other because they shared a love of literature. They dreamed of making books together, her as an editor, him as a writer. But it wasn't just the way that they were alike that made them work so well. It was also the ways that they were opposite but complementary. Bernard loved to write, Avis loved to edit. Bernard loved attention, Avis cherished her privacy. Bernard loved to eat, Avis loved to cook. All her life she was fascinated with food and with cooking. Remember that. This is the first photograph of the DeVotos together. This is them on their honeymoon in 1923. But Avis could never truly know her husband Bernard until she knew where he came from, the U.S. West. And so in 1925, Bernard took Avis to Ogden to meet her father-in-law, Florian. He had come west on the Transcontinental Railroad and stayed to work as a land title specialist for the Union Pacific Railroad. And while the DeVotos were in Ogden, Bernard wanted to show Avis what in his youth had been a paradise, the Wasatch National Forest. So they rented a little cabin in a high mountain valley, and when they got there, they were aghast at what they saw. Because in World War I, in order to boost lumber production, logging regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And in order to boost beef and wool production, grazing regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And when the DeVotos were up in this denuded landscape, a rainstorm hit, and a flash flood came at them, and it almost killed them. The DeVotos made out a lot better than a lot of Westerners in the 1920s because flash floods devastated towns and cities all over the region. Pueblo, Colorado, Escalante, Utah. Pardon. Pause for technical support. There we go. Pueblo, Colorado got flooded. Silver City, New Mexico got flooded. Escalante, Utah got flooded. Always for the same reason, because of conservation failures. Being grazed almost to extinction was the postboard. So while it was working on his grandpa's farm that gave DeVoto an appreciation for public lands, it was these deadly floods of the 1920s that made him understand the imperative of protecting public lands. And that passion, which both DeVotos shared for the rest of their lives, pitted them against the great nemesis of their lives, Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Senator McCarran is another forgotten figure in American history, and he shouldn't be, because in our history there has rarely been another politician so powerful, paranoid, vengeful, bigoted, corrupt, and absolutely genius as Pat McCarran. If any of you have seen The Godfather 2, it opens at Lake Tahoe with mob boss Michael Corleone being shaken down for a bribe by corrupt Nevada Senator Pat Geary, who is the fictionalized version of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Early Nevada was so corrupt, it was known as the Rotten Borough. And Democratic Senator McCarran embodied that corruption. He cultivated a constituency that lived in mansions at Lake Tahoe and owned ginormous ranches out in the desert. And on behalf of this acquisitive constituency, Senator McCarran went to war against a conservation agency that Franklin Roosevelt had created to help fight the Dust Bowl. The Roaring Twenties in America were followed by the Dirty Thirties, and to protect the last of the deep-rooted native grasses that held the soil in place, Franklin Roosevelt created an agency called the Grazing Service. It was modeled after his cousin Teddy Roosevelt's Forest Service. The Grazing Service was tasked with protecting the West's grasslands and prairies and deserts and canyon beds. And McCarran went to war against the Grazing Service in a very manipulative and duplicitous way. He announced he was going to hold a series of open public meetings all across the West where anybody could come and voice concerns about public lands management. But secretly, McCarran stage managed these meetings so that only the people he wanted to hear from got speaking times. And the people he wanted to hear from were the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest bull growers. And all the people he didn't want to hear from got their voices diminished and dismissed. And this was a plurality of Westerners. These were small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife lovers, trade unionists, irrigation farmers, municipal water suppliers. It included the DeVotos. But come the 1930s, the DeVotos put down roots a long way from the West. They settled in Massachusetts. First, they moved here to Lincoln, Massachusetts. They moved to Weston Road. This was before there were even numbers on houses on Weston Road. I had to learn that from Sarah. This place had a toboggan run. It had numerous bedrooms, bunches of fireplaces. It had a pool. They had a maid. The rent was $100 a month. If you wanted to move to the same place, which is now 22 Weston Road, it could be yours for a cool $3 million today. The 1930s is the decade when the DeVoto literary star takes off. In 1935, Bernard DeVoto was given the honor of writing the monthly Easy Chair column in Harper's Magazine. It's the oldest continuing feature in American journalism. It's still going on today. Writing the monthly Easy Chair column gave him gravitas, it gave him a national platform. It also gave him an outlet for his increasingly pointed and sometimes controversial opinions on subjects like conservation. Harper's Magazine didn't pay much money, so to subsidize this work, Bernard DeVoto wrote serialized fiction for big glossy magazines. These were like the Netflix series of that era. And with stories going out to magazines like the Saturday Evening Post and money coming in, the DeVotos began to live what looked like a pretty rich and glitzy lifestyle. So for these parties that became legendary. And if you look at Avis on the side of this photo series, you can see her reaction to some of the shenanigans on at these parties. Their success brought new literary luminaries into their lives, like Bemis lecturer Robert Frost, the poet. But while the DeVotos appeared to be living a very glitzy and kind of glamorous lifestyle, that masked the fact that they were actually going through some pretty intense private turmoil and pain. Robert Frost, pictured here eating wild berries with Avis, appearing to admire her while Bernard holds the camera. He tried to come between the DeVotos. And at the same time, Bernard began a relationship with this young woman, Catherine Stern. It was never a physical relationship. Kate Stern was a writer for the New York Times when she caught tuberculosis in her mid-20s. And she lived the rest of her relatively short life inside an iron lung. And from there, she wrote Bernard DeVoto a fan letter. And though they never met in person, they swapped hundreds and hundreds of intimate letters. And Avis knew about this, and she was okay with it, because she was all right with anything that Bernard DeVoto did to regulate his mood, because she knew the private hell that he was going through. part of the reason Bernard was going through hell is because he saw himself as a novelist, and he dreamed of writing the great American novel. And he did write novels, and they were lousy. He had mixed reviews, and none of them sold very well, and he had to come to grips with the fact that he didn't have a great novel in him. He was also somebody constitutionally who was just kind of never really at home anyplace. When he was growing up in the West, he was too interested in what might be happening in intellectual capitals like Harvard to really fit in. When he was finally at Harvard, he was too fascinated with Western history to really fit in. And nowhere was Bernard DeVoto more of an iconoclast, more of a maverick, more of a total free thinker than politically. In the 1930s, the nation swung far to the left because of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and millions of Americans voted for socialist and even communist candidates for public office. And within the realm of academia and literature, more than a few voices looked to relatively young Soviet Russia as a utopia that America should emulate or possibly submit to. And within his realm, nobody more loudly and rudely than Bernard DeVoto said that anybody who thought that was an idiot. Bernard said that anybody who thought that communism was viable, anybody who thought that Karl Marx was particularly smart, was suffering from a, quote, imbecile delusion. And so in the 1930s, people called Bernard DeVoto a fascist. And so there's this combination of things, this always putting intense pressure on himself, this never really being at home any place, and certainly not with any group, and this total free thinking, this always zagging when popular opinion zigged. This could leave Bernard DeVoto feeling very isolated, and he went through some suicidal depressions. Fortunately, Avis provided the emotional stability and support to get him through these depressions. And come the 1940s, they had started a family. They had 2 sons, Gordon and Mark. And this is the decade when the DeVoto literary star reaches its heights. Bernard DeVoto will write a trilogy of Western history. And this great trilogy will win numerous awards. It will cement his literary legacy. Bernard DeVoto finds his true voice writing nonfiction about the West. And the first book in this great trilogy is The Year of Decision, 1846. In cinematic prose, Bernard tells about the grit of soldiers in the Mexican-American War. He tells about the exodus of Mormons who flee persecution and search for religious freedom in the deserts of what will become Utah. He writes about the Donner Party who get trapped atop the Sierra Nevada mountains in winter and survive by cannibalism. This book comes out at the low point of World War II, and it's seen as an allegory for what American soldiers are going through, fighting Imperial Japan and fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And because this book so inspires U.S. soldiers, it becomes a smash hit. DeVoto's next book works even farther back in history, the heyday of the Rocky Mountain fur trade in the 1830s. Across the wide Missouri, which wins the Pulitzer Prize, it tells the story of the Mountain Men. DeVoto's next book works even farther back in history. The Course of Empire, which wins the National Book Award, it features 2 characters who Bernard DeVoto affectionately refers to as my boys, Lewis and Clark. Bernard DeVoto wrote so expertly and so evocatively about the explorers Lewis and Clark that he would get fan mail like this from some Boy Scouts in Long Island. And you can see these scouts have created letterhead with elaborately drawn scenes from the Lewis and Clark journey, and they've drawn a map of the Lewis and Clark Trail, and these Boy Scouts beg Bernard DeVoto, take us with you. guide us along the Lewis and Clark Trail, because come 1946, the end of the war, that is exactly what Bernard DeVoto intended to do. He was going to take Avis and their boys on the trip of a lifetime. They were going to drive from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail, visiting national parks and public lands all along the way. And Bernard expected to write at least one column for Harper's about this. And based on what he had followed in the West in the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the good work that it had been doing, he expected this to be a positive column. And when the DeVotos went west for research, as they did a number of times, they really did it up. They wanted to talk to everybody that they could. They wanted to learn everything they could. Bernard would go out hiking with Forest Service officials so he could learn the plants, the wildlife, the ecosystems. Avis would befriend National Park Service rangers. They'd see the scenery. This is Avis and Gordon by a geyser in Yellowstone Park. This is Avis and Gordon riding them on a chairlift to the top of a peak in the Colorado Rockies so they could get a panoramic vista of the mountains. Bernard was too afraid of heights to join them. But he would go flying around with smoke jumpers who took off from the little airport in Missoula, Montana. They would get out on the water. This is Avis looking typically fashionable. Jenny Lake and Grand Teton National Park. Bernard would float in a little boat down the Missouri River in eastern Montana with the great Montana novelist Bud Guthrie Jr. One thing DeVoto would always do, wherever he was, is he would get down on his hands and knees and he would check out the grass because he wanted to see if the ranges were being overgrazed. And the answer to that question after 1946 was yes, because of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. With the world distracted by war, the McCarran hearings on public lands escalated, and they took on a sadistic twist. McCarran began to order employees of the Grazing Service and the Forest Service and the Park Service to attend his public meetings, and he would forbid them to speak while he invited his hand-picked audience members to shout insults at them. A McCarran aide said the purpose of this was to affect these conservation professionals, quote, psychological, unquote. And as these hearings went on, McCarran began to say that America was becoming filled up with communists and that these domestic enemies were going to destroy the United States of America, and that he, Pat McCarran, was going to find these traitors and stop them. And so during the war, Pat McCarran went from just amplifying the voices of people he wanted to hear from, the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest oil growers, and dismissing the voices of people he didn't want to hear from, to demonizing the people that he didn't want to hear from. And people who descended from Pat McCarran, remember, are a plurality of Westerners. They're small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife advocates, municipal water suppliers, trade unionists, irrigation farmers. Based on that rigged investigation that he led, Pat McCarran flexed his power on a Senate Appropriations Committee, and he slashed the budget of the Grazing Service so deeply that he destroyed it, this conservation agency that FDR created to fight the Dust Bowl. Because Pat McCarran so defunded the U.S. Grazing Service, in 1946, the new president, Harry Truman, combined what was left of it with the moribund and historically corrupt General Land Office to create a new and enfeebled conservation agency, the Bureau of Land Management. This is the birth of the BLM, the first BLM. It should better have been called the Bureau of Pat McCarran. The writer Edward Abbey would soon say that BLM stood for Bureau of Livestock and Mining, which is exactly what McCarran wanted. The DeVotos go west the same month that the BLM is born, June 1946. They're in their 6-year-old Buick sedan, filled with all the supplies that they're going to need for 3 months, and they don't yet realize the implications of what McCarran has just done. And when they first arrived in the West, they were having a great time. They were learning their history, seeing the scenery, buying souvenirs, posing for family photos. We'll have to ask Mark if he still has that feather headdress. Well, what they saw turned tragic when they got to the Dakotas, and they witnessed the beginning of the Garrison Dam. The Garrison Dam across the Missouri River was going to flood out some 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, all without permission from those nations. This painful photograph is of the siting that officially, quote, authorized, unquote, the already under construction Garrison Dam. The gentleman weeping as the sole tribal representative. When the DeVotos see scenes like this in the middle of the 1900s, they are horrified because they thought scenes like this were something out of the 1800s. And Bernard DeVoto knows from his deep study of U.S. history that the biggest public domain frauds, the biggest public land scams went hand in hand with this kind of native dispossession because the common denominator is greed. It's natural resource looting, natural resource plundering. DeVoto can chart the whole history of Western settlement through a series of natural resource rates for fur, gold, timber, grass, oil, water, the land itself. He knows that if he's seeing scenes like this in Indian country, he needs to have his eyes and ears open in case something even bigger is being worked up in secret, something else that threatens federally protected lands in the West, something that might lead back to Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, seen here on a reservoir catching a bass. Following the Lewis and Clark Trail, the DeVotos get to the eastern Montana ranching community of Miles City, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe. Because remember, DeVoto loves to eat, and he knows that the Range Rider serves the best steak dinner in America. He will gleefully tell his readers on the seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone can they get a steak anywhere near as good as the one he can get for $1.50 at the Range Riders. But while they're in there, they eavesdrop, and Bernard overhears a, quote, very loud, very drunk cattleman, unquote, give him a tip. The tip is that his hunch is correct. There was a much bigger plot being worked up in the West, and it did lead back to Pat McCarran. That the same tactics that Pat McCarran used to destroy the U.S. Grazing Service were next going to be used to destroy the U.S. Forest Service and then the National Park Service. And at this juncture, the DeVotos transformed into investigative journalists because they decided that if they could somehow just get the exact details of this plot they heard rumors out inside the Range Riders Cafe, they could print the details in Harper's Magazine, they could expose it, maybe they could stop it from happening. And so their National Park Lewis and Clark adventure turns into a networking odyssey. And they went across the West meeting with sources, asking people if they knew any details about this plot. In Great Falls, Montana, they met with Joseph Kinsey Howard, who is rightfully in the state's Journalism Hall of Fame. He wrote one of the best books about the state, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. In Yosemite National Park, they met with their mutual friend Ansel Adams, the green landscape photographer. They asked what he knew. In Wyoming, they met with another mutual friend, the novelist Wallace Stegner. Asked him what he knew. But they got their big break in Bernard's hometown of Ogden when they met with this guy, Chet Olson, a Forest Service official. A Forest Service official who through the 1930s led hundreds of CCC workers up into the Wasatch Mountains, and they replanted grass and they replanted trees and they stopped those deadly floods. And Chet Olson knew something. He knew that in August of 1946, more than 100 of the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest wool growers were going to meet in Salt Lake City. And at that gathering, a small group was going to meet in private, and they were going to hash out a legislative agenda. And that legislative agenda would have all the details that the DeVotos had been searching for, from the Dakotas through Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon and California and Nevada and Utah and Colorado and Wyoming. It all would be revealed there. And of course, presiding over this entire meeting is Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Somehow, that Forest Service official got a copy of that secret document into Bernard DeVoto's hands, and what he read set his stubby hair on fire. The plot is this. to take every acre under the jurisdiction of the new and enfeebled Bureau of Land Management, transfer them to states, and sell them off, around 150 million acres, and then have McCarran-approved survey crews go into the national forests, national monuments, and national parks, and transfer out as many as 80 million additional acres. All told, the amount of acreage that could be going to the auction block topped 230 million. Bernard DeVoto called it a land grab, the biggest land grab in U.S. history. This kind of calico-looking map that Westerners know shows what was at stake. The yellow is BLM land, the light green is Forest Service land, the salmon color is Indian country, the dark green is national park land. Bernard DeVoto writes, Senator McCarran has been the ablest representative of cattle and sheep interests in Washington against the West and the people of the United States. And he puts that in the January 1947 issue of Harper's Magazine in an explosive double-length feature that he titles The West Against Itself. That being a reference to politicians like McCarran, who for political gain and quick cash would liquidate the natural resources of the West, which is to say the future of the West and of America. And he explains this very complex plot in plain, simple language. The plan is to get rid of public lands altogether, turning them over to the states, which can be coerced as the federal government cannot be, and eventually to private ownership. This is your land we are talking about. So DeVoto writes this, incidentally, just a few years after Woody Guthrie has written This Land Is Your Land, but before that song became a classic. That article, The West Against Itself, it did everything that the DeVotos hoped that it would. It rendered that land grab suite of legislation too radioactive for any politician to touch. Bernard DeVoto remembered later that his article, quote, fused an explosion, unquote. The DeVotos stopped as many as 230 million acres of America's public lands from being sold off in the 1940s. But as the 1940s turn into the 1950s, a very powerful new ally comes to the aid of Pat McCarran, or rather, somebody who had been a nobody in Congress, transformed into the most prominent member of Congress simply by acting like Pat McCarran. You'll note that when McCarran gets fan mail, it comes with stickers on it that say, "I'm for McCarthy." One of the challenges that historians have had in writing about the McCarthy era, named for the Wisconsin senator and demagogue Joe McCarthy, is that when it came to the man himself, there wasn't much there. He didn't have coherent principles. He didn't have consistent values. The two things that Joe McCarthy could always be counted on to want were alcohol and attention, which are two things that I also always want. To understand the McCarthy era, you have to understand Pat McCarran, because Pat McCarran is the godfather of McCarthyism. If you wanted to learn what was going to come out of the mouth of young Republican Joe McCarthy, you needed to only look at what had just come out of the mouth of old Democrat Pat McCarran. Remember, it was McCarran in the 1940s who said that America was becoming filled up with communists. That's what Joe McCarthy said in 1950, only when McCarthy said it, it went that era's version of viral. And so McCarran and McCarthy became a duo of sorts because each one had something that the other one did not. Joe McCarthy had an incredible genius for attracting attention and getting publicity. This is why we talk today about the McCarthy era and McCarthyism instead of what we should talk about, the McCarran era and McCarranism. But McCarran had a genius for legislating. So the actual laws that represent McCarthyism were all passed by Pat McCarran, and these are some of the most oppressive laws in the history of the United States. Pat McCarran legalized concentration camps in America. And Joe McCarthy's innovation was rhetorical. It was a way of talking. It was the art of the smear. It was a way of making innocent people sound dangerous by allusion and inference and innuendo and gossip. It was a way of achieving a dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. And that McCarthyist way of speaking started to get picked up on by some of Pat McCarran's allies in the West, including a gentleman named J. Elmer Brock, who was the one-time president of the powerful Wyoming Stockgrowers Association. After Bernard DeVoto exposed and thwarted the land grab, J. Elmer Brock decided to inform on Bernard DeVoto to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. He did it on his livestock company's stationery. Brock told Hoover that as far as the sentiments of the stockmen in the West, we would like to see Bernard hanging from a cottonwood limb. And maybe that's fine, maybe that's just a guy blowing off some steam, except that Brock included in that parcel to Hoover an article that the Wyoming stockgrowers had published in their own magazine, which asked whether the United States would be better if Bernard DeVoto just moved to Russia, or whether DeVoto should, quote, have a hammer and sickle over his desk. This is from Bernard DeVoto's FBI file, and we can see that Sully has underlined the hammer and sickle bit and drawn a big black arrow to it. Now, if the Wyoming stockgrowers had written, quote, Bernard DeVoto is a communist, unquote, he could sue them for libel. But if they just asked whether the United States would be better if he moved to Russia or whether he ought to have a hammer and sickle over his desk, they achieved that dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. That's the essence of McCarthyism. And that way of talking and the fact that the FBI was now collecting it, that was of grave concern to Bernard DeVoto. Pictured here at his desk, there's neither a hammer nor a sickle over it. He thought it was a threat to the Bill of Rights because it jeopardized Americans' right to due process. So in late 1949, he wrote the most controversial column of his career, Due Notice to the FBI. This is one of the first articles in a national publication to criticize Joe McCarthy, but more so, it takes the FBI to task for collecting McCarthy-esque slander and gossip and innuendo and backbiting. When this article appeared around that time, a Gallup poll showed that 78% of Americans thought the FBI was doing a good job versus only 2% who felt the other way. This article shows Bernard DeVoto at his most maverick, his most iconoclastic, his most courageous. And when this article came out, J. Edgar Hoover was furious because people did not criticize the FBI in this era. And Hoover put Bernard DeVoto on the FBI's fearsome do not contact list and blasted out a memo ordering it to all 48 FBI state headquarters and all 3 territorial headquarters. And Hoover launched an extensive FBI investigation into whether a specific person had inspired Bernard DeVoto to write due notice to the FBI. And I don't want to give you spoilers, it's in my book, but I can tell you that Hoover and the FBI failed. And at the risk of sounding self-aggrandizing, I can also tell you that I found what they did not. The answer is deep inside of Bernard DeVoto's archive at Stanford University. And when I started to look into this, whether I can find out if a particular person inspired Bernard DeVoto to write due notice to the FBI and who that person might be, I thought it might likely be a Harvard professor or one of their neighbors in Cambridge. So I was shocked to find out that it's this gentleman, whose name is Roald Peterson, who lived in my hometown of Missoula, Montana. Roald Peterson worked for the U.S. Forest Service. His job was regulating grazing ranges. This is exactly the type of public servant that Pat McCarran wanted to drive out of a job. And the story of what happened to Roald Peterson, I learned by finding one of his granddaughters who's still alive. And she told me a story passed down by her late mother that was baroque and ridiculous and tragic. But in the Montana Historical Society, the Missoula County Courthouse, and in Roald Peterson's FBI file, I found contemporary documents that corroborated the entire thing. What happened to Roald Peterson was this. In 1949, 2 anonymous FBI informants accused him of having once been a communist. He wasn't. At best, they were mistaken. At worst, they were malicious. But because he was accused, he had to undergo a loyalty investigation. These were incredibly intrusive, very scary processes. And while he was going through this loyalty investigation, Montanans of every political stripe, by the dozen, he and I would testify in his defense. They said he was an asset to the state, a benefit to the republic. But the stress of going through this loyalty investigation ordeal was hell on his family. Rold had married a woman who was from New Orleans, and while he was going through this loyalty investigation, she suffered a psychotic break. And her sister had her committed to what was then unfortunately named the East Louisiana Asylum for the Insane. And while she was on her way there, she spoke to a man in New Orleans who decided to also inform on Rold Peterson to the FBI, based on his understanding of a conversation he had with a soon-to-be ex-spouse who was on her way to a literal insane asylum. That's a type of source that Hoover found credible. And this source told the FBI that it sounded to him like Rold was, quote, behaving like a homosexual. This is in Rold Peterson's FBI file. And this came at a time, mind you, when Joe McCarthy was going across America saying he was going to expose all, quote, communists and queers, which was high irony, because working for Joe McCarthy at that time, as he had just worked for Pat McCarran, was the infamous attorney Roy Cohn, a closeted gay man who all that time was in love with the gentleman sitting on the other side of Joe McCarthy, G. David Scheib. But for Americans who were not as politically connected as Roy Cohn, the results could be tragic. Based on that new false allegation, Rold was fired from the U.S. Forest Service. And because of that, he lost his family's ranch in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. I don't know if any of you have seen the TV show Yellowstone, but the actual property that they have cast as the Dutton Home Ranch in that show, that is actually in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Rold lived not too far away. That's an example of what was taken from Rold. A Montana judge trying to decide custody of the kids between an institutionalized mom and an accused dad put the kids into foster care, and they were sexually abused. When the two youngest kids ended up committing suicide. This is the human cost of McCarthyism. And something not dissimilar happened to another Bernard DeVoto conservation ally. This is Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. Senator Hunt's son was arrested in Washington, D.C. on suspicion of being gay, and two of McCarran and McCarthy's Senate allies blackmailed Senator Hunt and told him that if he did not resign immediately, Joe McCarthy was going to go to Wyoming to make a campaign issue out of his son's arrest. This came 45 years before the brutal murder of gay University of Wyoming student Matthew Shepard. You have to read my book to see what happened to poor Senator Hunt. We have all seen some of Senator Hunt's legacy. He was the guy who chose this to be the emblem of the state of Wyoming, the buckaroo on the Bronco. What Bernard DeVoto could see was that a pattern had emerged, that people who stood between Pat McCarran and his attempts to grab natural resource wealth, those people found themselves persecuted, harassed, accused, smeared, targeted. And come the 1950s, Pat McCarran had a new method of grabbing public wealth and funneling it to his Western cronies. Dams. Multi-million-dollar dams. Dams are an incredibly complex conservation issue. They make life possible for tens of billions of people in the West. They also waste a lot of water and do a ton of ecological damage. But come the 1950s, so many dams had already been built that this tenuous balance was at risk of being overturned permanently, because some of the only places left where dams could be built were inside national parks, because you have to have certain physical parameters to build a dam. You have to have a canyon. Once again, Pat McCarran flexed his might on Senate appropriations committees. He withheld money from the National Park Service so that it couldn't defend itself, and he poured money into the two big dam building agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so, empowered by McCarran, the Reclamation Bureau and the Army Corps, they drew up plans to build dams inside of national park units, including the Grand Canyon in Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon in Arizona, Yellowstone, Wyoming, Glacier National Park in Montana, Kings Canyon National Park in California, Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. This wasn't just a Western issue. Fort Donelson National Battlefield, Tennessee. But the first guillotine blade to fall, the first domino to drop, was going to be a dam built here in the middle of Dinosaur National Monument, which straddles the border of Colorado and DeVoto's home state of Utah. If a dam could be built inside Dinosaur National Monument, that would give the green light for all those other dam projects to move forward. And if America could not protect its national parks, its best known and most beloved public lands, no other acre of public land stood a chance against being exploited and liquidated. And Bernard DeVoto knew what he had to do. He had done it before. He would write another blockbuster article. He would let the people know what was going on, but he wanted this article to reach even more eyeballs than Harper's Magazine. So he placed it in the biggest and best read magazine of his era, the Saturday Evening Post. And he gave it another attention-grabbing headline: "Shall we let them ruin our national parks?" That's Dinosaur National Monument in the background. This 1950 article let the American people know the threat that dams posed to national parks and public lands. And what happened when Bernard DeVoto let people know about yet more malfeasance that ultimately Pat McCarran was behind? Well, it got Bernard attacked coast to coast by McCarran's understudy, Joe McCarthy, in the lead up to the 1952 presidential election, the only election in which Joe McCarthy was a player. The person who Joe McCarthy attacked most conspicuously often and most viciously was public lands journalist Bernard DeVoto. But that's a scuba, by the way. But this being Joe McCarthy, when he went on nationwide TV to tell America to be afraid of Bernard DeVoto, this is the audio portion of the presentation, Joe McCarthy called him, that's incredibly silent, I apologize for that. Joe McCarthy on national TV called Bernard DeVoto Richard DeVoto. Unfortunately, McCarthy wasn't done. He began to attack magazines that published DeVoto's conservation writings, and DeVoto began to get blacklisted from the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest and Fortune magazine. And this was a crisis for conservation because the DeVotos were the most important spokespeople for plans in their era. It was also a crisis for the DeVoto family, because if Bernard couldn't get published, they couldn't keep a roof over their head. Fortunately, Bernard had Avis, and Avis had Bernard, and they began collaborating more closely together than ever before, brainstorming new and alternative story ideas that Bernard could pitch and write, sometimes under a pseudonym. He did a lot of writing in this era for Woman's Day magazine. They were looking for stories and story ideas that he could do that would compensate for his getting blacklisted. And Avis suggested that Bernard write about kitchen knives, which he did under his own name in Harper's Magazine. And in early 1952, that got him a letter from a new fan and ally, Julie Child. One of the things that Avis did for Bernard was she answered a lot of his fan mail. So Avis wrote Julia back, Julia wrote Avis back, and they discovered they had such incredible chemistry that they became best friends for the rest of their lives. And Julia confided in Avis. Julia told Avis that she had a dream of writing an encyclopedic cookbook of French recipes. And Avis, who had been fascinated with cooking ever since she was a little girl, she was so excited and inspired by this idea from this woman she never met named Julia Child that Avis promised Julia, having never met her, that she would use Bernard's contacts in the publishing industry to get Julia Child a breakout book deal. This friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, particularly between Avis DeVoto and Julia Child, it's very well known, as it should be. They have a wonderful collection of letters. They're all at Harvard University. But really, I don't think enough attention has been paid to how much these two incredible families influenced each other. So if you'll indulge me with this show and tell format, I want to give you a taste, pun intended, of the love and emotion that was part of this great friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs. The Childs added the DeVotos to a special list of dear friends to whom they would every year send handmade valentines. Paul Child was a very talented artist, and he would hand make these valentines, and sometimes they could be funny, like this kind of whimsical Victorian-looking scene. Sometimes they could be in the sky. Paul and Julia in the bathtub together. Sometimes it can be very ornate. This Valentine that Paul hand-painted looks like it could be a stained glass window. Sometimes Paul's composition could be risque, as his photo that Julia took of him painting en plein air, shall we say. This is a poem that Paul wrote from the back of that Valentine, and you can see that the first letter of each line spells from top to bottom, to Avis and Bernard. This is a photo of Julia Child's kitchen in France in 1953, and on the shelf, where you might expect to find a cookbook, instead you find The Course of Empire by Bernard DeVoto. This is a collection of cards of organizations that Bernard DeVoto belonged to. There's ones you expect. There's his National Parks Lifetime Pass, his Sierra Club membership card, his membership card from the Outdoor Writers Association of America. And up in the top corner is his official honorary membership in the École des Devots Gourmands cooking school that Julia Child taught in France. Like I said, this friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, particularly between Avis and Julia, it's very famous. It's been in books, it's been on TV, it's been in a hit movie. What people don't understand about this incredible friendship is that it's a conservation story. It came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to protect our public lands and national parks. And the Childs weren't the only new friends and allies to join the DeVotos' crusade. Oops, I'm going to let I got technical difficulties. I'm going to let this logger in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains introduce the next one. He says, I'll be goddamned I never thought I'd meet Adlai Stevenson here. Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and in 1954, he asked Bernard DeVoto to give him a field lesson in conservation. So they met in secret in Missoula, Montana, and Bernard took Stevenson up into the Bitterroot Mountains and taught him about chain smoking. They tell him about his passion, rangeland health, friends, grass holds the soil. This is grassroots politics. And Stevenson starts to get the DeVoto public lands philosophy. Somebody about the sloppy campsite. He yells out, clean it up, son of a bitch. But DeVoto impresses on Stevenson that the number one reason for public lands conservation is to protect the sources of clean, cold water, which is the lifeblood of the West, in which Stevenson attempts to catch a cutthroat trout in. If Stevenson is elected president, Bernard DeVoto is probably going to be either his Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of the Interior. But DeVoto is thinking ahead, just in case Stevenson is not the guy to get his public lands conservation ideas into the White House. He's also keeping up a robust conservation correspondence with his senator here in Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. But that's all in the future. Come 1955, the crisis for conservation in the West is this river, the Green River, and whether a dam is going to be built on it inside a Dinosaur National Monument, taking a landscape that looks like this and making it look about like this. And the American people don't want this. Letters to members of Congress about this proposed dam are 80-1 against it. But the dam still has all the momentum it needs to get built because nobody machinates minority power in government better than Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, who is simultaneously marshaling all the cultural power of McCarthyism. People who oppose this dam get called disloyal, communist, weak, gay. At the height of the fight against this dam, even Paul Child got put through a loyalty investigation. He was accused of being gay, despite all the documentary evidence he could provide to the contrary. This jeopardized Julia's career because Paul worked for the State Department. That was the only reason that Julia Child was in France learning how to be a chef to begin with. Avis would always think that this loyalty investigation of Paul Child was retribution for the Childs being allies of the DeVotos. And all of this weighed heavily on Bernard DeVoto, on his mind. All this nasty politics, this fear for his country, meaning the public lands in West, this fear for his country, meaning the United States. He didn't help himself out by smoking all the time, by drinking a ton, by hardly ever sleeping, by working around the clock. He was trying to build a coalition of fiscal conservatives and environmentalists that might blunt the power of these two giant federal dam building agencies. Bernard DeVoto asked if the wilderness was destroyed, how would anybody know in 100 years what wonders there were in this America of ours? But in 1955, he got another one of these opportunities that he always tried to seize on, a chance to address a mass audience of Americans about conservation. This time it came via a new technological medium, television. He was asked to go to CBS Studios in New York City and tell the story of Mesa Verde National Park. Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado is part of the ancestral Puebloans' homeland. The ancestral Puebloans lived for centuries in the American Southwest. They irrigated farmlands, they built towns. The ancestral Puebloans built the tallest skyscrapers in North America until Chicago in the 1880s. And tree rings tell the story that around the year 1200, the climate changed a little bit and megadroughts struck. And the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their towns and farms and cities, and they vanished. And DeVoto thought that a parable about a civilization in the American West that vanished when it didn't conserve its water, that would transform American public opinion about dam building toward caution and conservation and preservation. And Bernard DeVoto wanted to put everything that he had into this broad cause, growing up in the West and learning about the West and traveling around the West and writing about the West and talking to Westerners and bringing new allies and advocates into the West, including this gentleman in the white hat that is book publisher Alfred Knopf. Remember him? He wanted it infused with the spirit of all the cigarettes that he smoked in the West and all the laughs he had at his buddies in the Forest Service. This is the juncture in my book talk, friends, when I have to apologize to you because despite my aversion to spoilers, I don't see any way to get around letting you know here that Bernard DeVoto doesn't make it. He died right after that TV broadcast, November 13th, 1955. But had he lived until the end of the month, he would have seen headlines like this all across the valley. A victory for Bernard DeVoto. Because of the coalition that he built and led, he convinced the Eisenhower administration to reverse itself and to not build a dam inside Dinosaur National Monument. This upheld the sanctity of the National Park Service. This upheld the precedent of not exploiting and liquidating every acre of federally protected land. The credit should certainly go to Bernard DeVoto, but should equally go to Avis DeVoto, because without Avis, there never would have been a Bernard. And when he died at the age of around 58, Avis was only 51, and she was devastated because not only had she lost her romantic partner at 33 years, she also lost her professional partner. The professional skills that Avis lent to Bernard DeVoto included editing and copy editing and proofreading and indexing and fan mail answering. Fortunately, when Avis was at her lowest, she had one of the best friends in the world. Julia Child rushed a plane ticket to Avis DeVoto and brought her to Europe. And Julia spent weeks caring for Avis, nurturing her, cooking for her, taking her around. And Julia slowly set Avis's heart on the long path toward healing. And eventually Avis had a realization that although she could never have another romantic partner, she could have another professional partner. And so Avis DeVoto transferred to Julia Child all the professional skills that she had lent to Bernard DeVoto, copy editing and idea generating. And Avis DeVoto was the only person who Julia Child had deputized to answer her fan mail. And so it's because of Avis DeVoto that these books got published, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2. They got published by Bernard's buddy, Alfred Knopf. Avis kept her promise. Through this presentation, I've been able to show you some film of Bernard DeVoto that I found that had been moldering in a university archive for decades. I was never able to find any footage of Avis. So to show you what animate Avis might have looked like, I have to turn to the silver screen. This is Deborah Rush opposite Meryl Streep as Julia Child. 2009 movie Julie and Julia. Right now on HBO Max is a series called Julia that stars Bebe Neuwirth as Avis DeVoto. This is one of the great friendships in American history. This is a friendship that came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. When Avis grew elderly, she joined with other women in her adopted hometown of Cambridge, and they got this park built. This is JFK Memorial Park. For her efforts in 1984, the Cambridge City Council voted unanimously to honor Avis by etching her name into Harvard Square. So today at the corner of Brattle and Mount Auburn is a ledge that reads, "Bernard and Avis DeVoto, Friends of Cambridge Conservation." Though Bernard had been dead for decades, Avis still wanted him beside her. But, of course, that's not the only place where the DeVotos are publicly honored. There's also the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove atop the Bitterroot Mountains near the border of Montana and Idaho, where the Clearwater National Forest. That grove was dedicated in September 1962. That is the DeVotos' Forest Service buddy, Chet Olson, speaking at the dedication ceremony. The person who escorted Avis to the ceremony was Montana Senator Lee Metcalf, pictured there with her on the front of my hometown newspaper. And at the ceremony, Senator Metcalf read aloud a special message from President Kennedy. And Kennedy began by honoring Avis. And it went on to talk about how he had been inspired by Bernard DeVoto. And Avis would write Kennedy back. Avis would also visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove one more time. After Bernard DeVoto died, Avis arranged for his ashes to be spread over the Clearwater National Forest from the smoke jumper plane. And when Avis died, her son Mark, pictured with her there at the dedication ceremony, he brought her ashes to the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove and scattered them. He spiritually and literally brought his parents, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, back together again. In that September 1962 thank you note that Avis wrote to President Kennedy, she offered him some advice, because Avis was daring like that. She offered unsolicited advice to the President of the United States. Avis's advice to Kennedy was that someday he should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. She told him that although there were more scenically spectacular places in America, she had never found another place that was at once so majestic and so peaceful. We know Kennedy was never able to take her up on that, but I feel like it's good advice to wind down on. If you are ever fortunate enough to be traveling Highway 12 across the Bitterroot Mountains and you're near the border of Idaho and Montana inside the Clearwater National Forest, you should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. You'll find that it's still everything that Avis said it was. And even if you're not fortunate enough to be able to stop, even if all you can do is note the sign as you pass by, now you all know. There's a pretty interesting story behind it. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Newman.
Thank you. Didn't I say that was a great story? Great storyteller? You never. Thank you very much. The mic will travel around if you raise your hand, if you have questions or comments, and we have help with the Mac, and they'll grab the mic. I'm going to start off by asking the most obvious question. What were the parallels you see today and the perils for our public lands and now?
This one died.
Yeah, that is a perilous question. Well, I mean, that's, I started working on this project around 2015 is when I kind of got the first germ of the idea, and I sent in my manuscript in 2021. And so, during the years 2015 to 2021, I was writing about the top-down rescission of national monument land in Utah. And I was writing about native dispossession in the Dakotas. And I was writing about journalists being called enemies. And even though I was writing about those things in the 1940s and the 1950s, when I checked the headlines, I would see the exact same things. And so I mean, it, it's not too hard to see the parallels between McCarthyism and Trumpism. And I'll cite a much more prominent historian than me. I was listening to Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and she was interviewing John Meacham, and he commented that the Trump experience for us all is the President Joe McCarthy that we never got to experience. So, again, I started this in 2015. So it certainly wasn't anything conscious that I tried to yield. As a matter of fact, it kind of psyched me out while I was working on the book, because there were so many times when I was writing about from the 40s and 50s was so similar to what was in the news headlines that sometimes I second guess myself and think I should take sections out of the book, like that it was too parallel. Like people would think I was writing about now as opposed to writing about then. But there are these histories, and that's why I thought it was an important story to tell, because it was really scary in the McCarthy era, and a lot of really good people got hurt really bad. And I think the DeVoto's story showed that there was this way to fight back, to hopefully not use a cliche word, resist. They built coalitions. They didn't get scared. They didn't get discouraged. They kept speaking up. They kept speaking honestly, and they built themselves a community. So, I thought that was an important story to tell.
Others?
Just drop them.
Don't be mad.
You throw it.
Be mad. No? Yes.
No.
Oh, in there you go.
Send the youths scampering.
And please be sure and introduce yourself and stand up and speak. Thank you.
Hi, it's Libby Bradshaw, and I was just interested in the graphics were just wonderful, and I wondered where and how you had found them, and if you could tell us a little bit of the stories about unearthing some of that amazing footage and photos. Yes.
Thanks for that question. I was enormously blessed with this project that I was writing about people who were incredible archivists. Bernard DeVoto has an amazing archive at Stanford University, and Avis DeVoto's letters to Julia Child and to some other notable folks like MFK Fisher, they are inside the Julia Child collection at Harvard University. And so I was able to find wonderful images. I was able to find that video reel, which actually I first saw. Mark has a copy of that. He showed it to me, but I found the original one. It's out at Stanford University, so I was able to use it. And then I found other things. I was able to use Freedom Information Acts to get FBI files, and I went to Wyoming to get Wyoming Stockbur's documents. I went to Reno, Nevada, where all of Pat McCarran's papers were. And so again, when I was looking through them, I found all these wonderful images. And that was kind of why it was fun to put together this book talk, because you get a book and you get 8 pages of black and white panels in the middle to share stuff, or had all the really cool images that I was able to find. And so it was fun to be able to share it all with them.
Hi, Arthur Walker. I live in Concord now, but in the late 60s, my sisters and I, in our high school years, were growing up in Boise, Idaho, and my parents, who were both naturalists, took us up to Glacier Park. And my first knowledge and even hearing of Bernard DeVoto was stopping at that Cedar Grove place. The year was about 1967. And my father got out of the car and told us that Bernard was one of his Harvard professors in the 1930s. So my connection to, and I didn't really know about Avis then, but that was my beginning of my education. And the question that follows is, could you talk a little bit more about Bernard's days at Harvard. He taught at Harvard. He was a professor, and I'm interested to know more about his Harvard career.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that. Yes, for a time in the late 20s and early 30s, Bernard, he graduated Harvard. He went back to Ogden for a little bit. He actually met Avis at Northwestern University in Chicago, where he was a professor. And then they settled in Cambridge. And when he first came back, he wanted to just be a freelance writer. But then the Depression hit, and he started as a tutor at Harvard, and he eventually worked up to English professor. And he did get it in his mind that he wanted to be a tenured Harvard person. And there was a lot of faculty politics. You know, again, like this is the 1930s, and there were a lot of people at Harvard that were, you know, really progressive. And this is the era when people called Bernard DeVoto a fascist. And so he really intellectually clashed with some of his colleagues at Harvard. And so while he was trying to get a tenure track, some of his colleagues, some of these colleagues who said he was, quote, subsidizing fascists, unquote, they undercut him. He was certainly disappointed about it, but I think he and certainly everybody else realized that that disappointment for him was actually a great bit of fortune for America, because then, you know, his energies were spent writing history and writing about conservation instead of being on the faculty at Harvard. But that's wonderful that Des Professor, a low-lucky guy.
I don't need that.
Okay, this is Mark.
You can hear me.
Yeah.
I'm glad you put up the picture with Kate Stern, who was a Wellesley graduate, class of 1928, I think, maybe 29. She wrote my father a fan letter about one of his magazine stories. He wrote back saying, thanks for the letter, but why do you read this trash? And then he says, I'm sending you a copy of my Mark Twain book that proves that I really have something to say. And they continued to write over a period of 11 years while she was a patient in the tuberculosis sanitarium. And they never met in person, not even once, but they exchanged 800 letters. And I published a portion of those. It's available from the University of Utah Press. It's been in print for a little over 10 years, but I think last year it sold just one copy. Though I urge you, if you want to know a little bit more about Bernard DeVoto's style of writing after he had been sitting at the typewriter all day long, batting out an article or an easy chair, and wanted to relax, he would stay at the typewriter and bat out a letter to Kate Stern. And she died in 1944. And the letters all came back. She had saved them all and came back to him, and he went through them and said, hey, there's some great stuff here. But he never got around to doing anything more about it, but I did. So
Yes.
a wonderful book, and it's such a hard thing to write this book. I just had to marvel. Avis DeVoto marveled. But yeah, Bernard DeVoto would wake up in the morning and he would write all day long professionally, Pulitzer Prize winning histories, National Book Award winning histories, the greatest columnists of his time. At 6 o'clock, he would take a break and have a martini at cocktail hour. That was a sacred hour to him. And then after that, he would write letters until the wee hours just to relax. So he would work all day writing, and then he would relax into the early morning hours by writing.
this book on the RT and American whiskey is still in print, called The Hour, Tin House Books.
Amazing.
Bring one to you.
I don't want.
I don't like mine.
Okay.
Betsy Eingapart, retired National Park Service historian. Betsy. How did his papers wind up in Stanford?
That's a great question. Thanks, Betsy. They wound up at Stanford because his good buddy and ally, Wallace Stegner, founded the fiction writing program at Stanford. And, Avis was very protective of her. She did not want them to go to some place that Bernard DeVoto didn't want. She didn't want them going to the Library of Congress. He didn't want them going to the Library of Congress, but Bernard trusted Wallace Stegner, and Avis trusted Wallace Stegner, and he said, I will make sure that these have a home in the West, and that I will oversee them and make sure that they're well taken care of. And they're a magnificent archive. I was incredibly lucky to have that to work with when I was working on this book.
And Wally wrote biography.
Yes, I am not the first Herbert DeVoto biographer. There wrote a biography of Bernard DeVoto titled The Uneasy Chair. It came out in 1974. And if you think it's not intimidating to try to write the subject that Wallace Stegner has already covered, I can tell you that's not true.
I think we can take one more.
Anyway, well, I'm John Morick, and I'm just curious how the investigative roots.
Oh, right.
The Colin Bay, the physical and further investigative journals.
Oh, that's a great question. Thanks for that.
Can you repeat the question just for the stream?
Yeah,
Thank you.
He asked how I became an investigative journalist. And I could tell you that I worked for my high school newspaper. I worked for my college newspaper. I never sort of set out to be an investigative journalist, but I have worked on a lot of investigative journalism stuff. And in 2002, I interned at the Village Voice, who are an incredible investigative journalist, a guy who actually temperamentally, I didn't know who Bernard DeVoto was at that time, but after I learned about Bernard DeVoto, I saw so many similarities and parallel with this investigative journalist that I was an intern for at the Village Voice in 2002. Is a guy named Wayne Barrett. And Wayne is, in journalism circles, the name Wayne Barrett is hallowed. Wayne wrote the very first investigative biography of Donald Trump. He published it in the 1990s, and the book flopped because at that point in time, Trump was a has-been, a nobody. He was Mr. Zero everywhere. But Wayne saw, following his real estate deals in New York City in the 1980s, that there was really something malicious there. Wayne's insight was that Trump could not do a deal unless there was an element of, quote, moral larceny, unquote, in that deal. So, Wayne figured that out. Wayne was one of the first people to figure that out. He also wrote the first investigative biography of Rudy Giuliani. And that book didn't do very well either because it came out shortly after September 11. But in 2016, Wayne Barrett is the person that, Maggie Hayman and everybody else who's done such incredible Trump coverage, they all went to Wayne and they read his book and they picked his brain. And, it was Shakespearean. Wayne's funeral was the day before Trump was sworn in. But there were, I was very lucky with this book. Some of the people that I showed it to were some of my fellow Winters. So yeah, Wayne, I can never touch him. I can never touch Bernard DeVoto, but they were definitely mentors and inspiration to me. Thank you, everybody. This is so great.
Thank you, and it was free invite. And if you'd like a book, you can probably ask for it at the Concord bookstore, or certainly you can get it online.